Did you know Elvis Presley won all three of his competitive Grammy Awards for gospel music? Not for rock and roll, not for his ballads, for the hymns and spirituals he sang from his soul. Did you know he would sometimes stop a recording session for a pop song, frustrated, and launch into an hour-long gospel jam just to get the feel right again? Or that he considered becoming a member of a gospel quartet before he ever became the king of rock and roll. This was not a phase for him. It was not a side project. The gospel was the bedrock. It was the music he turned to when the lights went down and the world wanted too much. It was the sound of his childhood, the comfort in his grief, and the hope he clung to when he was alone in a crowd of thousands. These songs were his private conversations with something bigger than himself. And the stories behind them are the stories of Elvis himself. Number 22, what does a Swedish poem have to do with a Grammy in Nashville? The song is How Great Thou Art. It is one of the most powerful performances Elvis ever committed to tape. But the song he sang in Nashville in 1966 started its life 81 years earlier and thousands of miles away. It began as a poem. A Swedish man named Carl Boberg wrote it in 1885. He was a preacher and an editor. The story goes that he was walking home from a church service when a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in. And then, just as quickly as it came, it was gone. The sky cleared, the birds started singing, and a rainbow appeared. Boberg was so moved by the majesty of it all that he wrote a 9-stanza poem called O Stor Gud, which means, O Great God. That was the seed. It wasn't a song yet, it was just words on paper. A few years later, someone set Boberg's poem to an old Swedish folk tune. Now, it was a song, but it was still unknown outside of Sweden. It took a long journey to get to Elvis. First it was translated into German, then a Russian version appeared. This Russian version is what an English missionary, Stuart Kahane, heard in Ukraine in the 1930s. He and his wife were working with refugees. He was so struck by the song that he decided to write his own English lyrics, inspired by Boberg's original, but also by his own experiences in the Carpathian Mountains. He added verses about the woods and forest glens and about Christ's sacrifice. He published his version in 1949. This is the version we know today. The song still wasn't a global hit. Its big break came when it was picked up by the Billy Graham Crusades in the 1950s. George Beverly Shea, the Crusades' main vocalist, sang it regularly. The exposure was massive. The song was printed in Crusade pamphlets and included on albums. This is almost certainly where Elvis first heard it with any regularity. He was an avid watcher of religious programming, and the Billy Graham Crusades were a cultural phenomenon. He would have heard Shea's deep, resonant voice sing those words and felt their power. When Elvis decided to record it, it was a deliberate choice. He was in RCA's Studio B in Nashville on May 25th, 1966. He was there to record a gospel album, his second one. The session was for the album that would be titled after the song. He gathered his musicians, the Jordanaires, and his backing vocal group, the Imperials, led by his idol, Jake Hess. They started working on the song. The first take was rough. The second take was better. They were fine in the arrangement. On the fourth take, it happened. Elvis let go. He poured every bit of his faith, his doubt, his pain, and his hope into that performance. The final soaring note he hits is one of the most famous in his entire catalog. It was pure, raw, and completely authentic. That performance earned Elvis his first Grammy Award. It was for Best Sacred Performance in 1967. Think about that. After all the gold records, all the movies, all the hysteria of the 1950s, his first award from the music industry itself was for a 19th century Swedish poem set to a folk tune. It wasn't a commercial calculation. It was a declaration of what mattered most to him. He loved the song so much he made it a centerpiece of his live shows in the 1970s. It was a moment in the concert where the rock and roll star stepped aside and the boy from Tupelo who loved church music took over. He would perform it with a full orchestra and the Stamps Quartet backing him, and it would bring the house down every single time. It was more than a song, it was a testimony. Number 21, could one song truly revive a stalling career? by 1965, Elvis's career was in a strange place. He was still one of the most famous people on the planet, but his music was suffering. He was trapped in a cycle of bad movies with equally bad soundtracks. His singles were not climbing the charts the way they used to. The Beatles and the British invasion had changed the sound of popular music. Elvis, the man who started it all, was beginning to sound dated. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, and RCA Records were looking for a way to remind people that Elvis was still a vital recording artist. They found the answer in a can, on a shelf. The song was Crying in the Chapel, but the recording was 5 years old. Elvis had recorded it on October 30th, 1960. It was during the sessions for his first gospel album, His Hand in Mine. The song itself had a history. It was written by Artie Glenn for his son, Daryl. Daryl Glenn had been in the hospital for a sports injury and had a spiritual experience. He asked his father to write a song about it. The resulting track was a country hit for Daryl in 1953. Several other artists, including June Valley and Rex Allen, also had hits with it that same year. It was a well-known song. During the 1960 session, Elvis and his musicians were in a groove. They were at RCA's Studio B, and the gospel music was flowing freely. They recorded His Hand in Mine, I'm Gonna Walk Dem Golden Stairs, and other classics. Then they tried Crying in the Chapel. Elvis sang it with a simple, heartfelt sincerity. He wasn't trying to rock it up. He sang it straight. The Jordanaires provided their signature smooth background vocals. It was a beautiful recording, but when the album was put together, the song was left off. So, was another song from that session Surrender? RCA and the Colonel decided to hold them back. They saw them as potential singles, too strong to be just album tracks. Surrender was released in 1961 and went to number 1. But Crying in the Chapel just sat on a shelf for 5 years. In early 1965, with Elvis's chart performance slumping, someone at RCA had an idea. Why not release that old gospel track? It was a gamble. It sounded nothing like the music on the radio, but they had nothing to lose. They released it in April 1965. The result was stunning. The song shot up the charts. It reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the United States. It was his biggest hit in nearly 2 years. In the United Kingdom, it went all the way to number 1 and stayed there for 2 weeks. It was a massive, unexpected international success. It proved that people were still hungry for Elvis's voice, especially when he sang with genuine emotion. The song cut through the noise of the pop charts. It was a moment of quiet devotion in a sea of loud guitars. For Elvis, it was a validation. The music he loved most, the music he sang for himself, was the very thing that put him back on top. It was a temporary fix, as he would soon go back to the movie grind. But for a moment, Crying in the Chapel reminded the world, and maybe even Elvis himself, of the power he possessed when he sang from the heart. Number 20. Who was the father of black gospel that Elvis revered? The song is Take My Hand, Precious Lord. It is arguably one of the most important gospel songs ever written. And for Elvis, it was deeply personal. He sang it at his mother's funeral. But the story of the song is a story of immense tragedy, and it came from a man Elvis deeply admired, Thomas Dorsey. Dorsey is often called the father of black gospel music, but he didn't start there. In the 1920s, he was a successful blues musician. He went by the name Georgia Tom. He played piano for blues legends like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith. He wrote and recorded his own blues songs, some with suggestive lyrics. He was living in two worlds. He was a churchgoer, but he was also playing the devil's music. The turning point in his life was devastating. In 1932, he was in St. Louis for a revival meeting. He had just written a new blues song and was feeling successful. While he was there, he received a telegram. It said he needed to come home to Chicago immediately. His wife, Nettie, who was 9 months pregnant, had died during childbirth. He rushed home, heartbroken. He held his newborn son for a moment. The next day, the baby died too. Dorsey was destroyed. He said, God, you are not fair to me. He renounced his faith. He wanted nothing to do with God or music. He was in a deep, dark depression for weeks. A friend came to see him and led him to a piano. Dorsey's fingers found the keys. And out of his grief and despair, a new song came to him. He combined the melody of an old hymn, Maitland, with new words that were a raw plea to God. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. He had found his way back to faith through his music. This song became his life's work. He gave up the blues entirely. He dedicated himself to writing and promoting gospel music. He founded the first gospel choir in Chicago. He started the National Convention of Gospel Choirs and Choruses. He toured the country teaching his songs to church choirs. He brought the feeling and the rhythm of the blues into the church, creating a new, more expressive form of worship music. Elvis would have been aware of Dorsey's music from a young age. Growing up in Tupelo, Mississippi, he was exposed to black church services. He heard the passion and the spirit in their music. It moved him in a way the more reserved white church music did not. When Elvis recorded Take My Hand, Precious Lord for his 1957 EP, Peace in the Valley, he was paying homage to Dorsey and the entire tradition of black gospel. He sang it with a quiet reverence. He wasn't just performing a song. He was participating in a history of faith forged in pain. The connection doesn't end there. The song was also a favorite of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, it was the last thing he ever said to a musician. On April 4th, 1968, just before he stepped out onto the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, he saw bandleader Ben Branch. He said to him, "Ben, make sure you play Take My Hand, Precious Lord in the meeting tonight. Play it real pretty." Those were among his final words. Elvis, who was devastated by King's death, felt an even deeper connection to the song after that. For him, it was forever linked to his mother's passing and to the loss of a great leader who had also found solace in its words. Number 19 was a holiday single, actually a secret gospel record. In 1957, Elvis was at the absolute peak of his fame. Everything he touched turned to gold. That Christmas, he released 2 new songs. One was Blue Christmas, which would become a holiday standard. The other was a song called There'll Be Peace in the Valley for Me. Releasing a gospel song as the B-side to a Christmas single was an unusual move, but this was more than just a B-side. It was a statement, and it was a direct result of a television appearance that caused a national controversy. On January 6th, 1957, Elvis made his third and final appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. After the backlash from his previous hip-swiveling performances, the producers famously ordered that he be filmed only from the waist up. Elvis was frustrated by the censorship. He felt it was ridiculous. Towards the end of the show, he was given a moment to speak to the audience. He looked into the camera and said he wanted to do a song that was probably the prettiest song I've ever heard. He dedicated it to the audience. Then he and the Jordanaires performed Peace in the Valley. The performance was stunning. It was just Elvis, his guitar, and the 4 vocalists. It was stripped down, heartfelt, and deeply spiritual. The television audience, which was estimated at over 50 million people, was captivated. Here was the rebellious rock and roller, the man parents feared, singing a hymn with the sincerity of a choir boy. It was a brilliant move, whether intentional or not. It showed a different side of him. It calmed the fears of many adults. It was his way of saying, I'm not the menace you think I am. I'm a good Southern boy who loves his mama and loves the Lord. The public response was overwhelming. RCA was flooded with letters and calls from people wanting to buy the song. But it didn't exist on a record. Elvis hadn't recorded it yet. He had just performed it live on TV. The demand was so great that RCA rushed him into the studio. On January 13th, just 1 week after The Sullivan Show, he recorded Peace in the Valley at Radio Recorders in Hollywood. The song itself was written by the same Thomas Dorsey who wrote Take My Hand, Precious Lord. He wrote it in 1937 for the great gospel singer Mahalia Jackson. It became one of her signature songs. Elvis had loved a version by Red Foley and the Sunshine Boys, a popular country group. He modeled his own performance on their arrangement. RCA decided to release the song as part of a 4-song extended play EP record, also titled Peace in the Valley. It was the first time Elvis had released an EP of all new material. The record was a massive hit. It sold over 1 million copies, a huge number for a gospel record at the time. It proved that there was a commercial market for Elvis's sacred music. It opened the door for his future gospel albums. That one performance on The Ed Sullivan Show, a quiet act of musical defiance, not only calmed a nation of worried parents, but also launched an entirely new and vital part of his recording career. Number 18, how did a famous quartet end up singing with Elvis by accident? The sound of Elvis's gospel music in the 1950s is inseparable from the sound of the Jordanaires. Their smooth, blended harmonies were the perfect counterpoint to his lead vocal. But their first recording session with him almost didn't happen, and it started with them literally bumping into him in the hallway. In January 1956, Elvis was in Nashville for his first recording session for his new label, RCA Victor. He had just left Sun Records. This was the big time. The sessions were being held at the Methodist Television, Radio, and Film Commission studios because RCA's own Studio B wasn't built yet. Elvis was trying to record I Got a Woman, but he wasn't happy with the sound. He had used a vocal group on his last Sun session, but they weren't available. He wanted that harmony. At the same time, the Jordanaires were in the same building working on a television show with Eddie Arnold. They were already a well-known and respected gospel quartet. They had been members of the Grand Ole Opry since 1949. During a break, Gordon Stoker, the group's manager and tenor singer, went to the coffee machine. He saw a young man standing there who looked familiar. It was Elvis. Stoker had met him once before backstage at the Opry. Elvis recognized him too. He told Stoker, "I'm having a hard time. The harmony's not right. Would you guys be willing to come sing with me?" Stoker was hesitant. The Jordanaires had a reputation to protect. They were a gospel group. This new guy, Elvis, was singing rock and roll. Some people in the church world were already calling it sinful music. Stoker told Elvis he would have to ask the rest of the group. He went back and told the other members, Neil Matthews, Hoyt Hawkins, and Hugh Jarrett. They were intrigued. They had heard Elvis on the radio. They knew he was going to be a big star. They decided to do it. They walked into the studio, listened to the song, and worked out their parts. They sang back up on I Got a Woman and Heartbreak Hotel that day. They didn't even get paid for the session. They just did it as a favor. Elvis was thrilled. He had found the sound he was looking for. He asked them to be his regular backup group. Again, they were hesitant. They had their own career. They were busy. Gordon Stoker laid out their conditions. They would work for him, but they would not go on the road with him. Their families and their own touring schedule came first. They also wanted to be paid a standard session fee, and they wanted their name on the records. Elvis and Colonel Parker agreed. This arrangement became one of the most successful collaborations in music history. The Jordanaires sang on hundreds of Elvis's recordings over the next 14 years. Their contribution was immense. They weren't just singing oohs and ahs. They were creating complex vocal arrangements on the spot. Elvis would sing a line, and they would instantly create a harmony for it. Their sound was a key ingredient in his success, on his pop hits as well as his gospel songs. And it all started because of a chance meeting at a coffee machine. Number 17, why did Elvis fire the Jordanaires for a younger group? The partnership between Elvis and the Jordanaires lasted for more than a decade. They were a crucial part of his sound through the 50s and 60s. But when Elvis decided to return to live performing in Las Vegas in 1969, the Jordanaires were not on stage with him. The story of their separation is a mix of professional logistics and evolving musical tastes. In 1968, Elvis filmed his legendary comeback special. The Jordanaires were there, providing their classic background vocals for parts of the show. It was a reunion, and it felt right. When Elvis started planning his return to the stage at the International Hotel in Las Vegas, he naturally wanted them to be his backing group. He asked them to join him, but the group had a problem. They were still one of the busiest session groups in Nashville. They were singing on dozens of hit records for other artists, from Patsy Cline to Ricky Nelson. They had built a lucrative career based on being available for studio work. The Las Vegas gig was a month-long commitment. If they went, they would have to turn down all that session work. They would lose a lot of money, and what if the Vegas shows were a flop? They would have given up their steady income for nothing. They talked it over. They made Elvis a counteroffer. They said they could do the first few nights with him to get the show started, but then they would have to return to Nashville. They suggested he could use a tape of their vocals for the rest of the engagement. For Elvis, this was not an option. He was putting together a massive live show with a full orchestra and a rock band. He needed live singers. A tape was out of the question. He was disappointed, but he understood their position, so he needed a new vocal group. He turned to the Imperials. This was a younger, more contemporary gospel quartet. Elvis had been a fan of their lead singer, Jake Hess, for years. In fact, the Imperials had sung on his How Great Thou Art album back in 1966 when the Jordanaires weren't available for one session. The Imperials had a more powerful, dynamic sound than the Jordanaires. It was less smooth, more soulful. This new sound fit perfectly with the high-energy, dramatic style of the Vegas shows. The Imperials backed Elvis from 1969 to late 1971. Their sound pushed him. They were a force on stage. But then they also decided to leave. They wanted to focus on their own career in the growing contemporary Christian music scene. Elvis then hired J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet. Sumner was another one of Elvis's childhood heroes. He was known for his incredibly low bass voice. The Stamps had a even bigger, more explosive sound than the Imperials. They were the group that would back him for the rest of his life. The split with the Jordanaires was not bitter. They remained friends, but it marked a significant change in his musical direction. He moved from the polished, controlled sound of the 50s and 60s to the bigger, bolder, more operatic sound of the 70s. His choice of backing vocalists reflected this change. The Jordanaires were the sound of his youth. The Imperials and the Stamps were the sound of his grand final act. Number 16 could a jam session with three other legends be his purest gospel moment? On December 4th, 1956, a remarkable, unplanned event took place at Sun Studio in Memphis. It has become known as the $1 Million Quartet Session. It was the only time that Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee Lewis were all in the same room singing and playing together. And for a large part of that session, they didn't sing rock and roll. They sang gospel music. The day started as a regular recording session for Carl Perkins. He had written the song Blue Suede Shoes, and Sun Records owner Sam Phillips was trying to find a follow-up hit for him. And Phillips brought in a young, wild piano player to add some spark to the session. That was Jerry Lee Lewis. Later in the day, Elvis Presley, who was by then a huge star at RCA, stopped by to visit his old mentor, Sam Phillips. He brought along his girlfriend. He sat down at the piano and started listening to the playback of Perkins' session. Then Johnny Cash, another Sun artist, showed up. The exact reason he was there is debated, but he was there. Suddenly, Sam Phillips had four of his biggest stars, past and present, in his small studio. He realized this was a historic moment. He called the local newspaper and told a reporter to get down there. Then he had the engineer, Jack Clement, start recording. What happened next was pure magic. The four of them started jamming. They played some of their own songs, but they quickly gravitated to the music they all had in common, the gospel hymns they had grown up with in the Assembly of God and Baptist churches of the South. They sang Peace in the Valley, Just a Little Talk with Jesus, I Shall Not Be Moved, and When the Saints Go Marching In. The tapes reveal a fascinating dynamic. Elvis is clearly the leader. He knows the words to almost every song. He calls out the key changes. He is the one driving the session. He sings in different voices, sometimes imitating his favorite gospel singers like Jake Hess or Bill Kenny of the Ink Spots. You can hear the pure joy in his voice. This wasn't a performance for a record. This was four young men sitting around a piano, singing the songs they loved, the songs that were in their bones. Jerry Lee Lewis is a powerhouse on the piano, adding his signature boogie-woogie style to the old hymns. Carl Perkins plays some beautiful guitar licks. Johnny Cash's voice is there in the mix, though it's often hard to pick out. The recordings are not polished. They are rough and informal. You can hear them laughing and talking between songs. At one point, Elvis talks about a gospel group called the Statesman Quartet and how much he admires them. He is a fan just like anyone else. This session is perhaps the most authentic glimpse we have of Elvis's relationship with gospel music. Away from the pressure of making a hit record, away from the screaming crowds, this is the music he chose to sing. It was his comfort food. It was his common language with these other pioneers of rock and roll. The newspaper article that came out the next day dubbed them the $1 Million Quartet. But the real treasure of that day was not the commercial potential. It was the sound of Elvis Presley at the height of his fame, going back to church at the studio where it all began. Number 15, who was the gospel singer Elvis tried to be? To understand Elvis's gospel singing, you have to understand Jake Hess. For Elvis, Jake Hess was more than just a great singer. He was the standard. He was the voice Elvis heard in his head when he thought about how a gospel song should be sung. And Hess was the lead singer for the Statesman Quartet, one of the premier white gospel groups in the country from the 1940s to the 1960s. Elvis was a devoted fan. As a teenager in Memphis, Elvis would go to the all-night gospel singings at Ellis Auditorium. He would sit in the audience and study these groups, particularly the Statesmen. He watched their stage presence, their sharp suits, their passionate delivery. But most of all, he listened to Jake Hess. Hess had a smooth, lyrical baritone voice with a distinctive cry in it. He could convey incredible emotion without ever sounding forced. He was a master of phrasing and timing, and Elvis absorbed it all. He would tell his friends, "I want to sing like Jake." You can hear Hess's influence all over Elvis's gospel recordings. The way Elvis holds a note, the way he scoops up to a high phrase, the little catch in his voice, much of that comes from listening to Jake Hess records over and over again. When Elvis sang Known Only to Him on his Hand in Mine album, he was essentially doing a loving imitation of Hess's style. The admiration was mutual, but it took a while for them to connect. Hess knew about Elvis, of course. He once recalled being told that the young rock and roll star would come to his concerts and sit on the front row. Later, when Elvis was in the army in Germany, he would play Statesman records for his buddies. He would point to the speaker and say, "Now you listen to this. This is the greatest singer in the world." Their professional paths finally crossed in a significant way in 1966. Elvis was recording his How Great Thou Art album. He had booked the Jordanaires for the session, but there was a scheduling conflict for one of the days. Elvis saw his chance. He asked his people to call Jake Hess. By this time, Hess had left the Statesmen and formed his own group, the Imperials. Elvis asked if Hess and the Imperials would come and sing backup for him. Hess was thrilled. They walked into the studio, and Elvis was like a kid meeting his hero. He was nervous and respectful. He showed Hess the songs he wanted to record. One of them was "Where Could I Go But to the Lord?" It was a song the Statesmen had been famous for. Elvis sang the lead, and Jake Hess and the Imperials provided the backing vocals. For Elvis, it was a dream come true. He was finally singing with the man he had idolized for so long. This was the beginning of a new chapter. The Imperials would go on to become his stage backup group in Las Vegas. And Jake Hess remained a friend and an influence for the rest of Elvis's life. When Elvis won his first Grammy for How Great Thou Art, it was an album that featured the vocals of Jake Hess. It was a fitting tribute. The student had learned his lesson so well that he ended up winning the industry's highest honor, with his teacher singing right alongside him. Number 14, what was the last gospel song Elvis sang for an audience? The last year of Elvis's life, 1977, was a difficult one. He was in poor health, and his performances were often erratic. But even in his darkest days, the gospel music was still there. It was his refuge. The final song he ever sang on a stage at his last concert was "Can't Help Falling in Love." But the final gospel song he performed for an audience tells a more poignant story. His last concert was on June 26, 1977, at the Market Square Arena in Indianapolis. The setlist for that tour was fairly standard. It included his big rock hits like Jailhouse Rock and Hound Dog, his Vegas-era anthems like My Way and An American Trilogy, and his tender ballads. But there was always a spot in the show for the music that was closest to his heart. On that last night, that spot was filled by How Great Thou Art. It was the same song that had won him his first Grammy a decade earlier. By this point, it had become an epic production. He had a full orchestra, and J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet were behind him, providing a wall of sound. His performance of the song had become more dramatic, more operatic over the years. There are recordings of that final concert. His voice is still powerful, but there's a weariness to it. When he gets to How Great Thou Art, something shifts. He seems to gather all his remaining energy. He pours it into the song. He sings it not just as a performer, but as a believer. The crowd, as always, goes wild. But the most telling part is the ending. After the song's massive crescendo, he does something he often did with that song. He reprises the ending. He sings it again, softer this time, more intimately. "O Lord my God, how great thou art." It's as if he doesn't want to let the song go. He is holding on to that moment of connection, that feeling of awe. Just a few weeks later, on August 16th, 1977, Elvis died. The last songs he sang were not on a stage, but at home at Graceland in the early hours of the morning. He sat at his piano in the Jungle Room and sang a few songs for his girlfriend Ginger Alden and his cousin. Accounts say he sang Unchained Melody and Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain, while Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain is a country song. Its theme of reunion in the afterlife has a spiritual, gospel-like quality. But that performance of How Great Thou Art in Indianapolis stands as his final public testament of faith. It was a song that had been with him through the best of times, the Grammy win, the triumphant return to the stage. And it was with him at the end, a declaration of faith from a man who was tired, worn, and in pain. It was the perfect, powerful farewell from the sacred side of Elvis Presley. At number 13, did Elvis see himself as a gospel singer who just happened to sing rock and roll? This is a question that gets to the very core of who Elvis was. On the surface, the answer seems to be no. He was the king of rock and roll. That was his title, his brand. But if you look at his own words and actions, a different picture emerges. He often seemed to view his rock and roll career as his job and his gospel singing as his calling. From the very beginning, his ambition was not to be a solo star. It was to be a member of a gospel quartet. He loved the harmony, the camaraderie, the shared purpose of a group. He auditioned for a professional gospel group called the Songfellows in Memphis. He didn't get the job. The story is that the group's leader told him he couldn't hear harmony. This rejection stung him, but it also set him on a different path. A few years later, he walked into Sun Records and the world changed, but he never lost that desire. Throughout his life, he surrounded himself with gospel singers. The Jordanaires, the Imperials, the Stamps, Kathy Westmoreland, his inner musical circle was made up of people from the church music world. When he was off stage, that's the music he played and sang. His friends and bandmates have told countless stories of Elvis stopping a party or a late night get-together to sit at the piano and sing hymns until the sun came up. It wasn't for show. It was what he did to relax, to connect, to recenter himself. He took his gospel recordings more seriously than almost anything else he did. He would labor over the vocal arrangements. He would do take after take to get the feeling just right. While he often complained about the poor quality of the songs he was forced to record for his movies, he never complained about the gospel material. He chose those songs himself. They were personal selections. His 3 Grammy wins tell the story. He was nominated for 14 Grammys in his lifetime. The 3 he won were for How Great Thou Art, the album, He Touched Me, the album, and his live performance of How Great Thou Art from the album Elvis recorded live on stage in Memphis. The industry that often seemed baffled by his rock and roll success recognized his absolute mastery of sacred music. In a 1972 interview, when asked about the message in his songs, he struggled to answer. But then he started talking about gospel music. He said, it's the soul singing, the spirituals of a man's belief, a man's search. That's what it's all about. In that moment, he revealed his true artistic priority. The rock and roll made him famous, the gospel music gave him meaning. He may have been the king of rock and roll to the world, but in his own heart, he might have just been a gospel singer who took a very long, very loud, and very successful detour. Number 12. How did a black gospel group from the 1940s shape his sound? Long before Elvis ever heard Jake Hess or the Statesman Quartet, another group captured his imagination. They were the Golden Gate Quartet. This was a pioneering black gospel group that became incredibly popular in the 1930s and 40s. They were different from other gospel groups of the time. They had a sophisticated rhythmic style that was almost a form of vocal percussion. They called it vocal jive. It was smooth, syncopated, and incredibly cool. They were one of the first gospel groups to achieve mainstream success. They had their own radio show on CBS. They performed at Carnegie Hall. They even appeared in Hollywood movies. For a young Elvis Presley growing up in the segregated South, hearing the Golden Gate Quartet on the radio would have been a revelation. Their sound was a bridge between the sacred and the secular. It had the spirit of the church, but it had the rhythm of the city. One of their most famous songs was Swing Down, Chariot. Their arrangement was complex and exciting. It featured rhythmic chanting, call and response patterns, and intricate harmonies. They could sound like a full band using only their voices. When Elvis decided to record Swing Down, Chariot for his Hand in Mine album in 1960, he went straight back to the Golden Gate Quartet's version. He didn't try to reinvent it. He and the Jordanaires did a faithful, loving tribute to the original. You can hear Elvis trying to emulate the lead singer's smooth delivery, and the Jordanaires, instead of their usual polished blend, adopt a more rhythmic, percussive style in the background. They are copying the vocal jive of the Golden Gate Quartet. This wasn't the only song where their influence can be heard. Elvis recorded another song they had popularized, I'm Gonna Walk Them Golden Stairs. Again, he used their up-tempo, rhythmic approach. This influence is a key part of the Elvis musical DNA. He was a master at blending different styles. He took country, blues, R&B, and pop and mixed them all together. But his love for black gospel, and specifically for the innovative sound of groups like the Golden Gate Quartet, was a foundational element. It gave his music a rhythmic drive and a soulful feeling that set him apart from other white singers of his time. He wasn't just borrowing a style, he was honoring a tradition that had moved him deeply as a child. Number 11. Was there a song he loved too much to finish? Recording sessions with Elvis could be intense, but they could also be filled with laughter. There is a famous outtake from the 1966 How Great Thou Art sessions that perfectly captures this. It shows a side of Elvis that the public rarely saw playful, loose, and so overcome with the joy of the music that he literally can't get through the song. The song was Farther Along. It's a classic gospel hymn from the early 20th century. Its lyrics are about trusting in God's plan, even when life is difficult and full of unanswered questions. It was a song Elvis knew by heart. He and the musicians gathered around the piano to work it out. The plan was to do a simple, stripped-down version. This is Elvis, the piano, and the vocal groups. They started the first take. Elvis is singing with deep feeling. The harmonies from the Imperials and the Jordanaires are beautiful. Everything is going perfectly. Then something happens. As they go into the chorus, Elvis's voice cracks with laughter. He tries to keep going, but he can't. He breaks down laughing. The whole take falls apart. They try again, take two. This time, they get a little further. But again, as they hit the chorus, the mood gets goofy. You can hear someone in the background, probably one of the singers, doing a funny vocal slide. That's all it takes. Elvis loses it again. He's laughing so hard he can barely sing. He starts ad-libbing silly lyrics. The other singers are laughing too. The session is turned into a party. They attempt a third take. This time, Elvis is determined to get it right. He starts the song with a serious, mock, dramatic tone. A 1, a 2, a 3, an A. He drawls. He sings the first verse beautifully. But you can hear the laughter just under the surface. As he sings the line, "Tempted and tried, we're oft made to wonder," he starts to giggle. By the time he gets to farther along, we'll know all about it. He is completely gone. He's laughing, the singers are laughing, the piano player is laughing. The song is abandoned. They never did get a complete take of Farther Along that day. The outtakes were eventually released on a compilation album, and they are a fan favorite. They offer a rare, unfiltered glimpse into Elvis's creative process. They show how much fun he had making this music. For him, gospel wasn't always a solemn, serious affair. It was also about joy, fellowship, and the sheer pleasure of singing with people he admired. He loved Farther Along so much that the joy of singing it with his friends simply became overwhelming. And in a way, that's a more perfect tribute to the song's spirit than a flawless take ever could be. Number 10, how did a William Faulkner novel and a slave spiritual combine for a hit? The song An American Trilogy became one of Elvis's signature anthems in the 1970s. It was a huge, dramatic, and patriotic showstopper. But it's not a gospel song in the traditional sense. It's a medley of 3 very different 19th century songs. And its creation has a surprising connection to a famous Southern novelist and a deep history of American music. The 3 songs are Dixie, the battle hymn of the Republic, and a slave spiritual called All My Trials. Dixie was the unofficial anthem of the Confederacy during the Civil War. The battle hymn of the Republic was the anthem of the Union Army. All My Trials is a folk song that originated in the slave communities of the Caribbean and was later adopted as a protest song during the folk revival of the 1950s. Putting these 3 songs together was a bold and complex statement. It was an attempt to musically represent the divisions and the eventual unity of the American experience. But Elvis didn't come up with the idea. The arrangement was created by a country and pop singer named Mickey Newbury. Newbury was a talented songwriter, but he was also a deep thinker who was fascinated by Southern history and literature. Newbury said the inspiration for the medley came to him in a dream, but the cultural influences were all around him. He was a great admirer of William Faulkner, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist from Mississippi. Faulkner's work constantly grapples with the legacy of the Civil War, the complexities of race, and the tortured history of the South. Newbury's medley is like a Faulkner novel set to music. It takes the conflicting symbols of the South Dixie and the North Battle Hymn and tries to reconcile them through the soulful, suffering voice of All My Trials. When Elvis heard Newbury's recording of An American Trilogy, he knew he had to sing it. It was perfect for his new grander stage persona. It allowed him to use his full dynamic range, from a quiet, whispered prayer to a thundering orchestral finale. He first performed it in 1972, and it immediately became a highlight of his show. For Elvis, the song was a powerful statement. He was a Southerner who had become an American icon. The song allowed him to acknowledge his heritage while also embracing a larger, more inclusive vision of the country. The spiritual heart of the medley is All My Trials. When Elvis sings, "Hush little baby, don't you cry, you know your mama was born to die," he is tapping into a deep well of pain and resilience. It's the most gospel-like moment in the song, a moment of profound empathy. By combining it with the martial anthems of the Civil War, he created a piece of music that was both patriotic and deeply soulful. It was a complex prayer for a complex nation. Number 9, did he really keep a Bible on his nightstand? Yes, he did. And he didn't just keep it there for show. He read it, he studied it, he underlined passages and made notes in the margins. For Elvis, the Bible was not just a holy book. It was a source of comfort, a guide for living, and a wellspring of inspiration for his music. His interest in religion and spirituality was lifelong and intense. He was raised in the Assembly of God Church, a Pentecostal denomination known for its passionate worship services and its emphasis on a direct, personal experience of God. The music, the preaching, the emotional intensity of that church shaped him profoundly, but his spiritual search didn't stop there. As he got older and his world expanded, he became a voracious reader of spiritual books of all kinds. He was fascinated by Eastern religions, mysticism, numerology, and the esoteric. He had a huge library at Graceland filled with books on these subjects. He was on a constant quest for answers to life's big questions, but he always came back to the Bible. It was his foundation. People who knew him well, like his friend and hairdresser Larry Geller, have spoken about the long conversations they would have with Elvis about Scripture. Elvis would sit for hours talking about the meaning of a particular verse or the life of Jesus. He was particularly drawn to the stories of the Old Testament and the words of Jesus in the Gospels. And one of his favorite books was The Impersonal Life, a spiritual text that he was introduced to by his hairdresser. He gave away hundreds of copies of it to friends and strangers, but even with all his other reading, the Bible remained central. The copy he kept by his bed was well worn. His notes in the margins were personal and heartfelt. They show a man who is genuinely wrestling with his faith, his fame, and his own shortcomings. This deep engagement with Scripture is what made his gospel singing so authentic. When he sang a song based on a Bible story or a psalm, he wasn't just repeating words. He knew the source material, he had thought about it, prayed over it. He understood the context. When he sang By and By or If We Never Meet Again, he was singing about a hope that he had read about and clung to in his own life. His Bible wasn't a prop. It was a lifeline. Number 8, why did he record an album of raw, live-feeling gospel in 1971? Well, by 1971, Elvis was a well-oiled machine. His live shows were slick, professional productions. His studio recordings were often heavily orchestrated. But in March of that year, he went into RCA's Studio B in Nashville and did something different. He recorded a gospel album that felt less like a polished product and more like one of his late-night informal jam sessions. The album was He Touched Me. The idea for the album came from his record label, RCA. They knew his gospel records always sold well and were critically acclaimed. They wanted a new one, but Elvis decided to approach this one differently. He wanted to capture the spontaneous energy of his private gospel singing. He brought in his touring band, including James Burton on guitar and Ronnie Tutt on drums. He also brought in his stage vocal group, J.D. Sumner and the Stamps. The atmosphere in the studio was relaxed and collaborative. Instead of working from detailed arrangements, they often built the songs from the ground up, right on the studio floor. The title track, He Touched Me, is a perfect example. The song was written by Bill Gaither, a major figure in the world of Southern gospel music. It was a relatively new song at the time. Elvis's version is powerful and emotional. He starts quietly, almost conversationally, and then builds to a massive, soaring chorus with the Stamps, providing a thunderous response. You can hear the excitement in the room. Another key track is Amazing Grace. It's a song everyone knows. But Elvis's version is unique. He arranged it himself. He gives it a slow, bluesy, almost swampy feel. It's unlike any other version of the song. It's deeply personal and full of soul. The album also includes up-tempo, joyful numbers like I've Got Confidence and Seeing is Believing. On these tracks, you can hear the band rocking out. It sounds less like a church service and more like a celebration. This was Elvis bringing his rock and roll energy to his sacred music in a way he hadn't done before. The album He Touched Me went on to win Elvis his second Grammy Award. It's easy to see why. The album is a brilliant fusion of all the parts of Elvis's musical identity. It has the rock and roll rhythm, the country soul, the blues feeling, and the gospel message. But most importantly, it has an undeniable authenticity. It's the sound of Elvis and his friends gathered in a room, making music they love. It's the closest he ever came to putting the spirit of his private gospel jams onto a commercial record. Number 7, who was the man with the world's lowest voice that Elvis idolized? And Elvis had many musical heroes, but few stood taller in his estimation than J.D. Sumner. John Daniel Sumner was a legend in the world of gospel music. He was known for his incredible booming bass voice. He was listed in the Guinness Book of World Records for many years for hitting the lowest recorded human note. But for Elvis, he was more than just a vocal phenomenon. He was the epitome of a gospel showman. Elvis first saw J.D. Sumner perform when he was just a teenager. While Sumner was singing with the Blackwood Brothers, another one of the top gospel quartets of the day, Elvis was mesmerized. He had never heard a voice that low. He was also impressed by Sumner's stage presence. He was a big man with a big personality. Sumner was also an innovator. He was one of the first gospel promoters to use customized tour buses, which he designed himself. He was a savvy businessman as well as a great singer. Elvis paid close attention to all of this. Their paths crossed professionally in the early 1960s when Sumner was with the Stamps Quartet. They sang backup on some of Elvis's recordings, but their close association began in 1971. Elvis's previous backup group, the Imperials, had left to focus on their own career. Elvis needed a new group for his live shows. He called J.D. Sumner. For Elvis, hiring J.D. Sumner and the Stamps was another dream come true. He was now employing one of his childhood idols. He and J.D. became very close friends. J.D. was an older fatherly figure to Elvis. They would talk for hours about music and life. On stage, their chemistry was electric. Elvis loved to feature J.D.'s low voice. He would often stop a song and have J.D. do a dive bomber, which was a vocal slide from a high note all the way down to the lowest note he could hit. The crowd would go crazy. It was a piece of musical theater that Elvis delighted in. You can hear it on many of his live recordings, most famously at the end of Why Me Lord. J.D. Sumner and the Stamps were with Elvis until the very end. They sang at his funeral. Their version of His Hand in Mine was a heartbreaking tribute to their friend and boss. The relationship between Elvis and J.D. Sumner was special. It was a bond forged in a shared love for Southern gospel music. Elvis, the king of rock and roll, was never happier than when he was on stage, sharing the spotlight with the man who had the lowest voice in the world. Number 6. Could gospel music have been an escape from the Elvis persona? Fame is a prison. For Elvis Presley, this was profoundly true. By the 1960s, he was one of the most famous and recognizable people on earth. He couldn't go to the store, he couldn't walk down the street, he was surrounded by his entourage, the Memphis Mafia, but he was often deeply lonely. He was trapped inside the image he and his manager had created Elvis, the movie star Elvis, the sex symbol Elvis, the icon. The gospel music was his escape hatch. It was the one area of his life where he could be not Elvis, but Elvis Aaron Presley, the boy from Tupelo. When he sang gospel, the persona fell away. He wasn't trying to be cool. He wasn't trying to sell records, though they did sell. He was trying to connect with something real and true, both within himself and beyond himself. The late-night gospel jams were the clearest example of this. These were not performances. They were private, spiritual gatherings. There was no audience, no applause. It was just Elvis and his friends singing for the sheer love of it. In those moments, he wasn't the king. He was just another voice in the choir. He could sing harmony. He could play piano. He could be one of the guys. It was a form of therapy for him. It was a way to wash away the phoniness of Hollywood and the pressures of stardom. His gospel albums were also a refuge. He had much more creative control over them than he did his movie soundtracks. He chose the songs, he worked on the arrangements, he poured his heart into the vocals. They were his personal projects, his artistic statements. They were the records he made for himself. Even on stage, in the midst of the Las Vegas spectacle, like the gospel songs were, a moment of retreat. When he sang How Great Thou Art or Why Me Lord, the energy in the room would change. The screaming would subside, replaced by a sense of shared reverence. It was a moment where Elvis the entertainer stepped back and Elvis the believer came forward. He was sharing the most vulnerable and sincere part of himself with his audience. The world demanded that he be larger than life, but the gospel music allowed him to be human. It reminded him of where he came from, of his mother's faith, of the simple truths he had learned in a small church in Mississippi. It was more than just a musical genre for him, it was his sanctuary. Number 5, what do his gospel Grammys reveal about his legacy? Elvis Presley sold more records than almost any artist in history. He had 18 number 1 hits in the United States alone. He is a cultural icon whose influence is immeasurable, yet when the Recording Academy, the organization that gives out the Grammy Awards, looked at his body of work during his lifetime, they consistently chose to honor one specific part of it, his gospel music. He was nominated 14 times for a Grammy. The nominations were spread across pop, rock, country, and R&B categories. But the only three he ever won in a competitive category were for gospel, his one. In 1967, the album How Great Thou Art won for Best Sacred Performance. He was also given a Lifetime Achievement Award in 1971 at the age of 36, but the competitive awards are telling. Why did the industry voters, his peers, consistently overlook his groundbreaking rock and roll and his chart-topping pop hits and instead reward his sacred music? There are a few possible reasons. First, in the 1950s and 60s, the Grammy Awards were often very conservative. They were slow to embrace rock and roll. They saw it as teenage music, not serious art. By the time the Grammys started to take rock more seriously in the late 60s, Elvis was seen as part of the old guard, not the new wave of artists like the Beatles or Bob Dylan. Second, there is the undeniable quality of his gospel work. It was sincere, powerful, and technically brilliant. Even people who didn't like rock and roll could recognize the incredible vocal talent on display in his gospel recordings. He wasn't just singing the songs, he was inhabiting them. His peers in the music industry could hear the passion and the commitment. They knew it was the real thing. But perhaps the most important reason is that the gospel music was the most Elvis part of Elvis. It was the music that came from the deepest part of his soul, unmediated by commercial pressures or Hollywood formulas. It was the music where his vocal gifts were on full display without the distraction of a hip swivel or a movie plot. His fellow musicians and producers could hear that. They recognized that this was where the heart of his artistry truly lay. His gospel Grammys are not a strange footnote in his career. They are a confirmation of what he and those closest to him always knew. He was a gifted pop singer, a revolutionary rock and roller, and a charismatic movie star. But he was, first and foremost, one of the greatest gospel singers of all time. And that is the legacy that his own industry chose to honor. Number 4, how did a song he performed on TV get him banned from South Africa? This is a strange and complicated story that involves Elvis, a British folk singer, the BBC, and the apartheid regime in South Africa. The song is If I Can Dream. It is one of the most passionate and powerful vocal performances of his career. And it was written specifically for him as the grand finale of his 1968 comeback special. The original plan for the end of the show was for Elvis to sing a standard Christmas song, like I'll Be Home for Christmas. It was supposed to be a warm, friendly, traditional ending, but the show's director, Steve Binder, felt that this was a missed opportunity. Robert F. Kennedy had also been assassinated. There were riots in the cities and protests against the Vietnam War. Binder felt that Elvis, as a major cultural figure, should say something about the state of the world. Elvis agreed. He had been deeply affected by the assassinations. He had long conversations with Binder about his hopes for a better, more unified world. So Binder asked the show's musical director, Walter Earl Brown, to write a new song that would capture these feelings. Brown went home and, inspired by Elvis's own words, wrote, If I Can Dream. The song is a plea for peace, understanding, and brotherhood. It speaks of a better land where all my brothers walk hand in hand. When Elvis heard the song, he loved it. He said, I'm never going to sing another song I don't believe in. He recorded it with a passion and fury that stunned everyone in the studio. His performance on the TV special was even more intense. Dressed in a white suit, standing in front of giant red letters that spelled his name, he poured every ounce of his being into the song. It was a raw, desperate, and hopeful cry from the heart. The song was a huge hit. It was seen as a major artistic statement from Elvis. But its message of racial equality was not welcome everywhere. In South Africa, the government was enforcing a strict system of racial segregation known as apartheid. The state-controlled South African Broadcasting Corporation, SABC, took one look at the lyrics of If I Can Dream and banned it. They refused to play the song on the radio. They went even further. They banned all of Elvis's records from the SABC for a number of years. a song of hope and unity inspired by the words of Martin Luther King Jr. and sung by a boy from Mississippi, was deemed too dangerous for the South African public to hear. It's a testament to the power of the song. It wasn't just a pop hit, it was a political statement, and in one of the most repressive corners of the world, the authorities heard that statement loud and clear, and they were afraid of it. Number 3, did he believe gospel music could heal? For Elvis, music wasn't just entertainment, it was a spiritual force, and he believed deeply that gospel music had the power to heal, both physically and emotionally. This belief came from his Pentecostal upbringing, where faith healing was a common practice. But it was also something he felt he had experienced in his own life. There are many stories from his friends and family about Elvis using music as a form of therapy. When his mother, Gladys, was ill, he would sing her favorite hymns to her to comfort her. After she died, he used the same songs to try to heal his own grief. He would sing "Take My Hand, Precious Lord" for hours, weeping, trying to find solace in the music. He also believed he had the ability to heal others through his faith and his touch. This was a private, more esoteric side of him that he rarely showed to the public. He would sometimes practice laying on of hands with his friends, trying to channel what he believed was a divine healing energy. Whether or not he had any success is a matter of personal belief, but the key is that he believed it. This belief in music as a healing force is evident in his recordings. A song like "He Touched Me" is a literal testament to this idea. The lyrics describe a moment of spiritual transformation and healing. When Elvis sings it, he is not just telling a story. He is bearing witness to an experience he felt was real. Another song that reflects this theme is "Reach Out to Jesus." It's a simple, direct song that encourages the listener to find comfort and strength in faith. He sang it with a gentle, reassuring tone. It was a musical invitation to be healed. This belief also explains the intensity of his live performances of gospel songs. He wasn't just trying to entertain the crowd, he was trying to create a moment of collective spiritual experience. He wanted the audience to feel the same sense of hope, comfort, and release that he felt when he sang the songs. He was, in his own way, acting as a musical faith healer for an audience of thousands. For the man who had everything the material world could offer, the true power, the power that mattered, was the power of faith expressed through a song. Number 2, why was a gospel song the perfect metaphor for his final years? "Why Me Lord" is a song written by Chris Christopherson. Christopherson wrote it after attending a religious service that moved him deeply. It's a song of humble gratitude and bewildered awe. The singer is asking God, "Why me, Lord? What have I ever done to deserve even one of the pleasures I've known?" It's a confession of unworthiness and a plea for help. Elvis first heard the song performed by the gospel singer J.D. Sumner. He loved it immediately. It resonated with him on a profound level. He started performing it in his concerts in 1974. His live version was a duet with J.D. Sumner. It became a staple of his show for the rest of his career. The song was a perfect and heartbreaking metaphor for his life at that time. Here was Elvis Presley, the most famous man in the world, a man who had more money, fame, and adoration than anyone could dream of. And yet, he was singing a song about feeling unworthy. "Tell me, Lord, what did I ever do that was worth loving you, or the kindness you've shown?" In the context of his life, these lyrics take on a tragic weight. He had everything, but he was also deeply troubled. He was struggling with his health, his prescription drug use, his loneliness, and the immense pressure of being Elvis. The song was a public expression of his private turmoil. It was a moment in the show where he could let the mask slip and reveal the vulnerable, searching man underneath. His performance of the song was always emotional. He would sing it with a raw, almost pleading voice. And the duet with J.D. Sumner was significant. J.D., his idol and friend, would sing the chorus, his deep voice providing a foundation of faith. Then Elvis would sing the verses, his voice full of doubt and wonder. It was a conversation between the believer and the seeker. At the end of the song, he would often have J.D. repeat the final line, "Why me, Lord?" Over and over, his voice dropping lower and lower with each repetition. It was a moment of pure gospel theater, but it was also deeply symbolic. It was the sound of Elvis at the peak of his fame, still asking the most basic questions of faith and existence. He was the king of the world, and he was on his knees asking for help. Number one was gospel music, his first love and his last hope. When you strip everything else away, the gold records, the movies, the jumpsuits, the legend, what you are left with is a man and his music. And for Elvis Presley, the music that defined him from the beginning to the end was gospel. It was his first love. Before he had ever heard of rock and roll, he was singing hymns in the Assembly of God Church in Tupelo. He was listening to gospel quartets on the radio. He was sneaking into black churches to hear a more soulful, spirited kind of worship. This music was his childhood. It was the sound of home, of family, of his mother's faith. It was in his blood before any other music was. It was also his last hope in the final years of his life. As his physical health declined and his personal struggles mounted, he clung to gospel music like a life raft. The world he had built for himself was crumbling, but the promises of the old hymns remained. Songs like "I'll Fly Away," "If We Never Meet Again," and "Known Only to Him" spoke of a peace and a release that he desperately craved. The very last album he released in his lifetime was Moody Blue. It was a mix of live tracks and studio recordings. But the last gospel song he ever recorded in a studio was for the 1976 album From Elvis Presley Boulevard, Memphis, Tennessee. The song was Danny Boy. While not strictly a gospel song, he sang it with the soul and reverence of a hymn. But if we look for a more traditional gospel track, we go back to the He Touched Me sessions. Think about the arc of his life. It started with a boy singing Old Shep, a heartbreaking song about losing a beloved dog at a talent contest. It ended with a man singing "How Great Thou Art" to a stadium full of people, trying to hold on to his faith. The journey between those 2 points was extraordinary, filled with unprecedented fame and unimaginable pressure. Through it all, the gospel was the constant thread. It was the music he used to test the acoustics in a new studio. It was the music he used to warm up his voice before a show. It was the music he sang in the back of his limousine. It was the music he sang to himself when he was alone. It wasn't a part of his career. It was the core of his being. He won his only awards for it. He found his truest friends through it. And in the end, it was the only music that could speak to the deepest longings of his soul. He was the king of rock and roll, but he was a servant of gospel music.